Okay, you're good to go ahead and start.
Thanks. Welcome everyone to the 2024 Utah BRIC and FMA briefing. I am Eric Martineau, and I'm the pre-disaster mitigation coordinator for the state of Utah, and I'm over the BRIC and FMA programs.
And I'm Kathy Holder. I'm the State Hazard Mitigation Officer and the Mitigation Section Manager.
I'm Miranda Miller. I'm the Post-Disaster Mitigation Coordinator, and I cover H&GP at DEM.
My name is Alex Greer, and I'm a mitigation planner here with DEM.
And then my name is Janessa Alada, and I'm also a mitigation planner with DEM.
And my name is Mason Kemp. I'm the mitigation planning lead with the DEM.
All right, welcome everyone. All right, for next slide. All right, the agenda today, we're just going to do a high-level overview of BRIC and FMA programs and what happened for the past few years and some eligibility requirements. And then we will go over the entire sub-application process from beginning to end and the requirements that are needed. To this briefing will basically be designed for people for two reasons: those who are applying for BRIC or FMA to get them the information they need, what are some of the new changes that we've noticed, and for those who are considering it, whether they should apply or not and what's all involved, and to give you a better idea of your chances, how hard or easy it is, and through the whole process. We will also go through the benefit cost analysis that's required for project grants, and then the state and FEMA review process, as well as some assistance that Utah can provide for certain communities called direct technical assistance. And then we will open it up for Q&A, and where you can ask any specific question you want related to your project or to any general. Next. All right, just to quickly highlight some of the new updates this year for the Utah process, so as well as some other things, is because FEMA has not opened up the application in FEMA Go, they've switched how they do it. They now will wait until the notice of funding opportunity has opened. Utah will be doing the initial sub-applications in a Google Doc, so everyone will get a Google Drive folder with a Google version of the sub-application that can be filled out. That isn't the official sub-application, but it gives a chance for the state to review your sub-application like we have done previously. The exception are those who are reapplying. They can wait until it opens up in FEMA Go and then work on copying over their previous sub-application. New this year is projects under $1 million can now do, instead of a BCA, they can do it in a narrative format, and we will go through that. And another thing new this year is everyone will be required to fill out a sub-application review checklist, and we will talk about that. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to briefly go over what the statistics are for the last few years for BRIC and FMA. Next. All right, so for BRIC started in the year 2020, and so we have 4 years of data right now. As you can see, the blue columns are the amount Congress allotted for each year. So the first year was 500 million, and then it went up to $1 billion. 2022 was a rare exception, went up to 2.3 billion, and then it went back down to $1 billion. So the red ones are those who are considering doing project grants in the competitive one. You can see for the first year, 377 million, and then it went up to just under 800, then almost 2 billion, and then it went back down to only around 674 million. The yellow is the state allocation as well as state management cost grants. And so you can kind of see what you're competing for here. And the bold numbers in the bottom are the amount that around the nation how much federal amount they receive. So in other words, for the first year, there was only 500 million available federal money, but yet FEMA received over 4 billion in requests. So you can see the kind of the odds there. And so for last year, out of 1 billion, there were 5.6 billion amount that was total requested amount. So next slide. So this is just a little bit of a summary. So the blue is the total number of sub-applications FEMA received. As you can see, last year they had the highest number they've ever received before. The green is the number of that state set-aside and state management cost grants they received. So basically like stuff that's allocated. And the competitive stuff in the orange, you can kind of see the first year they had 607 and only 22 projects were selected, or if you had a 3.6% chance of getting selected. And then you can see the next year only 53 out of 419 were, and then 124 out of 478, and last year 56 out of 626 project competitive applications. There's another thing they just started last year, which was called Building Code Plus Up, as you can see, which was part of an allocation. And before that was part of the state set-aside allocation, which would have been in green, but they separated it out for last year. We will see if they continue that this year when the NOFO comes out, but just so you can see, that took a chunk of the amount available for project grants. So just want to get you an idea of your odds. You can kind of see, and we'll now go to the next slide for Utah specific. So as you can see, Utah, again, the blue was the number of NOIs we received for the last 4 years. Green are the state set-aside NOIs, the allocation. So last year we received 21, and we had submitted 8, and only 7 got selected, which was, and then we had 41 competitive projects that were NOIs. Only 15 people were able to finish their sub-application and submit it, and we received 0 project grants. So you can kind of see over the years, 2020 we didn't get any projects. 2021 we got 3 out of our 14. 2022 we only got 1 project out of 13. So in 4 years we've only received 4 competitive projects. So just be aware, this shows that BRIC grants are highly competitive on the national level, and you have to have really well done applications in order to compete. And we will talk through the requirements so you can see whether you feel like you can get what are the BRIC points, and we'll talk about the point system that it's based on, as well as some other things. Next slide. I just wanted to go over a few things that we learned that FEMA focused on last year when they were reviewing BRIC sub-applications. So some of the things they really looked at were community disaster resilient zones, which is sort of a new thing they came up with. And as you can see, Utah only has 3 small areas. If your project benefited any of these areas, one is down there by Zion's National Park, and there are 2 more. One is a very small section of South Salt Lake, just like a few blocks, and one was in Weber County, just a tiny little area. You can barely see it on this map. Those are the only 3 what's called cedar zones that we have in Utah. So we had a real disadvantage to get that priority from FEMA for last year. And the other one was this climate and economic justice screening tool, this CGEST. And you can see the counties highlighted in darker colors are the ones with the information that would benefit for this climate and economic justice. The darker, the more. And you can go to these websites to see. So if your project does affect any of these highlighted areas, I believe they're on census tracts, then you have a better, you can get a higher score, a better chance of getting selected. So you might want to take a look at those two things. Next slide. Okay, finally, just a brief thing on FMA. FMA is much more difficult to receive in Utah based on several factors that we'll go into, but just be aware in 2022, we submitted 2 project scoping grants and we got them, and we only received 1 of our 3 projects. And last year, we submitted 2 project scoping and 1 project submitted, and we're still waiting to find out the results of that. And those are the 2 years we submitted. Before 2022, Utah, we didn't really submit FMA. The last FMA grant, I believe the only FMA grant we received was in 2006. So we've only received 1 before, and then now in 2022, we'll have 3. So you can kind of see FMA is very specific, where you have to directly benefit properties in the National Flood Insurance Program, as well as some other things that we'll discuss. So now I'm going to turn the time over to Janessa.
Thank you, Eric. So here is a general overview to give you a visual sense of how many steps are involved once the sub-application opens to closing. So at the beginning, you see that the sub-application period opens. Then we have the sub-application is due to the state. Then the sub-application period ends. And in the next period, we have FEMA sub-application selection, FEMA RFI request for information, then FEMA obligation, then the grant award, grant management, completion of project, then submitting closeout to the state, then closeout to FEMA, and then FEMA closes the grant, and then retain records for 3 years. And then we'll move on to the next slide. This is our BRIC FMA timeline. So we can see here for our first deadline, we have August 30th, 2024. BRIC FMA notice of interest, NOI, is due to the state. And then in September 30th, 2024, the sub-application is due to the state. And in this period in the fall, this is where we'll be doing the state review, benefit cost analysis, BCA review, the RFIs, and the final submission to the state is in December 2024. And for this is the final submission. This is the FEMA Go submission to the state. And then in January 30th, 2025, this is when the state will submit the application to FEMA. And the next part, this isn't shown in the timeline, but between February and March, FEMA will begin their application reviews. And in that period of winter, spring 2025, they'll be looking through applications for eligibility, technical reviews, and completeness. Afterwards, the selection process begins, and final selections will be made and announced in the summer of 2025. So in that period of July, August 2025. In the fall, winter of 2025, FEMA request for information RFI process, and then they will obligate the money to the state to grant the project award. Next slide. And it's important to know the terminology. So we'll be using the word subapplicant and applicant, so it's important to know the difference. So subapplicant is state agency, county, city, town, tribal government, or special district government. And an applicant is Utah Department of Public Safety, Division of Emergency Management, which is DEM, us. All sub-applications go through the applicant. Next slide, please. There are 2 types of mitigation in BRIC. We have the physical mitigation projects, so that would be seismic retrofits, emergency generator installation, flood mitigation, fuels reduction, etc. And then we have our capability and capacity building activities, CNCB, which is our building codes, partnerships, project scoping, and planning. And something to know, physical mitigation projects are funded through the competitive funding, whereas CNCB is funded through state allocation. Next slide. So with our BRIC CNCB activities, these are only allowable under Utah set aside. Last year, our 2023 numbers, we received $2 million in federal. And then listed in the box below, right after the third point with mitigation plans first priority, we have our Utah allocation priorities. So the first one is mitigation plans. This is our first priority because you need a plan in order to apply for non-planning BRIC grants, and there's limited allocation funding available. After mitigation plans, our second priority is project scoping and other CNCB activities. And last priority is projects. Since BRIC started in 2020, we've never funded a project under state allocation because we've always had enough CNCB activities to fill the state allocation. And to the left, we have another box that's Building Code Plus Up, which Eric had briefly mentioned earlier. The Building Code Plus Up is a new category and separate from the regular CNCB activities. So the priorities I had just mentioned before don't apply to this Plus Up. This was to increase the range of building code activities to support building code adoption and enforcement measures to reduce risk and build community resilience. Last year, the state received an additional $2 million for the Building Code Plus Up, but it is unknown if they'll continue to fund this again this year or if it was a one-time thing. Next slide. And here's an overview of ineligible activities. I'll just start from the top to the left and then go left to right, up, down. So the first box, we have landscaping / open space acquisition of unimproved land. Construction groundbreaking has begun. So construction can't begin until after the award has been given. And then we have activities that only address man-made hazards. And then going down to the second row, we have deferred maintenance or repair, so things like roof repair. Next, replacement of existing buildings or obsolete utility systems. And the exception is if replacement of building or system is integral and necessary to perform proper mitigation. Next, new construction. So it must mitigate existing infrastructure, buildings, etc. And then last row, preparedness and response activities, purchasing equipment like sandbags, fire trucks, etc. Removal of brush and debris in floodplain, in riverway, not referring to wildfire fuels reduction. And last box, not a standalone project. So it has to be contingent on other activities. Next slide. Other considerations, it must not duplicate activities that another federal agency has more specific authority. It must be cost effective and technically feasible. Must not be dependent on another project. Must follow environmental and historic preservation, EHP laws, and that there's a $50 million federal share cap. Next slide. Flood Mitigation Assistance. FMA and BRIC will use the same sub-application in FEMA Go. You can apply for the same flood project under FMA and BRIC, but you must do 2 sub-applications. FMA differences is 1, it's based on its own scoring system, and 2, must benefit NFIP properties. Next slide. There are 3 types of mitigation in FMA. The first is physical mitigation projects, construction activities that mitigate / benefit NFIP properties on a community or on an individual level, such as with the goal of reducing NFIP insurance claims, taking NFIP properties out of the floodplain, increasing the level of flood protection to NFIP properties, etc. 2, project scoping. Includes such things as engineering studies, H&H studies, evaluations, etc., to help one in advance of choosing or developing an FMA mitigation project. And 3, capability and capacity building activities, CNCB. Partnership development, enhancing local floodplain management, severe repetitive loss / repetitive loss strategy plan development. Next slide. And these are subject to change, but as of last year's numbers from 2023, just to go over the amount that we've received. So projects, $50 million in funding, federal share cap per sub-application. For project scoping, $900,000 federal share cap per sub-application. And CNCB activities, $300,000 federal share cap per sub-application. Next slide. So the following table outlines the specific criteria with brief descriptions and available points. FEMA will select the highest ranked eligible localized flood risk reduction project sub-application based on the FEMA scoring criteria below. It's a challenge in Utah to get a lot of FMA points because it's difficult to meet many of the scoring criteria. I'll just be going over the first 3 categories a little more in detail, and the rest review what available points can be earned. So full and partial points are given in the first 3 categories. So the first one, Justice 40 community or community disaster resilience zone. These communities are considered disadvantaged, have been marginalized by society, overburdened by pollution, and or underdeserved by infrastructure and other basic services. All federally recognized tribes or tribal entities are Justice 40 communities, whether or not they have land. In this category, you can receive up to 300 available points. A sub-application that primarily benefits a community disaster resilience zone will receive 300 points, or a sub-application that primarily benefits a Justice 40 community will receive 200 points. The second category, main category, is National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP policyholder. NFIP provides insurance to help reduce the socioeconomic impact of floods. Points will be assessed for every NFIP policy that is active as of the FMA application start date and is verified within the benefiting area of the project. You can receive an additional 2 points per NFIP policyholders that your project can directly benefit, and the total points you can receive is up to 200. Flood Mitigation Assistance and NFIP define severe repetitive loss, SRL, and repetitive loss, RL properties. So FMA aims to implement projects that reduce flood risk post repetitively flooded properties insured under the NFIP and a disruption of life caused by repeated flooding of the same properties. You can receive an additional 5 points per repetitive loss and 10 points per severe repetitive loss. In total, receive up to 175 available points. In Utah, we've had very few repetitive loss properties and no severe repetitive loss. In the remaining categories, partial points are not given for these. So the consideration for climate change and other future conditions. If the planned project is resilient to any identified current and future climate risks, the sub-application will receive 100 points. Next, not next slide, just to clarify. Incorporation of nature-based solutions. If the project incorporates nature-based solutions, the sub-application will receive 100 points. FEMA Flood Mitigation Assistance Capability and Capacity Building, CNCB activities. If the project was generated from a previous FMA award, the sub-application will receive 50 points. Public and private sector partnerships. If the sub-application incorporates partnerships such as the state, tribal, private, local community, etc., the sub-application will receive 25 points. Community rating system, CRS participation. If the project participates in the community rating system, the sub-application will receive 25 points. And then lastly, Cooperating Technical Assistant Partner Program, CTP participation. The sub-application will receive 25 points if they are a cooperating technical assistance participating community. We know this is a lot of information, but if anyone is interested in applying for FMA, you can reach out to our team and we can go over the details and work with you one-on-one. That concludes my section of the briefing, and I'll move this over to the next person.
Okay, thank you, Janessa. So I'm going to go ahead and start by going over the sub-application process and requirements. And this will start the section on how to navigate FEMA Go. As Eric mentioned earlier, new this year, sub-applications will be done first through a Google Drive before being done in FEMA Go. This is due to FEMA not opening up the sub-application in FEMA Go yet. And one exception is that this will not apply to reapplies from last year. Every sub-applicant will be sent access to a Google folder that will contain a sub-application on a Google Doc. Please fill this out. This is what we will be using for the state review. After that, you must copy the contents over to FEMA Go when the sub-application opens up. In this folder, there will also be an attachments folder that you can include any attachments that you will be uploading. There will also be guidance and assistance documents. The official sub-application is done through FEMA's website, FEMA Go. New this year, in order to log into FEMA Go, everyone must create an account at login.gov. access to FEMA Go will occur through login.gov. And then you can just see a screenshot here of what login.gov looks like. Next, we'll go over FEMA Go and how to fill out the sub-application. When you go to the FEMA Go website, it will direct you to log in through login.gov. The BRIC and FMA sub-application opens up in FEMA Go when the NOFO is announced. Next, you will start your sub-application. First, you will choose the entity you're applying for, and that will be your entity. Next will be the organization you're applying to. Please keep in mind that the organization you're applying to is the Department of Public Safety, not the Division of Emergency Management. Next, you'll add an application title, and then you'll select the sub-application type, whether that be plan, project, or project scoping. When naming your sub-application, please include the entity name, include project-specific activity and location. For project scopings, please include project scoping in the title. You're welcome to use catchy titles as it may make your project more appealing to reviewers, but please do not make them overly crazy titles. Overly long, vague, or non-descriptive titles should be avoided. If you need to change your title at any point, you will go into FEMA Go and go to the Scope of Work tab, and it will be the first box under Sub-Application Title, and you can change that there. Next, we'll go over the sub-application sections for each of the different project types. So for project scoping, you've got the sub-applicant information, contact information, community, mitigation plan, scope of work, schedule, budget, cost effectiveness, evaluation, comments and attachments, and assurances and certifications. For plan sub-applications, the only difference between the two is you will not have a cost effectiveness section. For project sub-applications, there are a lot more sections that you will need to fill out. So we'll go through those. There is the sub-application, the sub-applicant information, contact information, community, mitigation plan, scope of work, schedule, budget, cost effectiveness, the environmental historic preservation or EHP review information, evaluation, comments and attachments, and then there will be a location section. This comprises 4 different sections, which is the project location, the project benefiting area, the project impact area, the project site inventory, and then you'll have the assurances and certification sections. There is the FEMA Go user manual, and this manual goes through each question in FEMA Go for each sub-application type. When writing your sub-application, make sure to use the exact verbiage from the BRIC points, such as nature-based solutions, risk reduction, implementation measures, future conditions, infrastructure project, and disadvantaged communities. These are what we call buzzwords. And if you look at the BRIC prompts document for verbiage, the reviewers will be able to score these sub-applications. When filling out the sub-application, the sub-applicant info, this you will start by doing the type of submission, and you will select application. Next is the sub-applicant subject to review by Executive Order 12372 process. You will select no. And this is for plans, project scoping, and projects. Next on the contact information tab, this applies to plans, project scopings, and projects. You will add at least 1 subrecipient authorized representative, as well as at least 1 point of contact. Sometimes the phone number and address of the SAR will be blank, and that is okay. Just please remember to add at least 1, if not multiple. And then under community, you will select the Find Communities button and add your community. The U.S. Congressional District will sometimes be blank. Please manually type the district number in the box provided. And this will apply to all 3, the plans, project scoping, and projects. And then I will go ahead and turn it over to Mason for the next few slides.
Sweet. Thank you, Alex.
So like as Alex was mentioning, and I'll just give a little kind of helpful guide for everyone watching the presentation. On the top right, you will see the different type of project application subtypes. There's the plan, project scoping, and project. If keep an eye on these, because as we're going through these different sections of the FEMA Go application, different requirements, as Alex previously outlined, we will see how those are highlighted and whatnot. So the first section we're going over, that I'll be going over, is the mitigation plan. So here you're going to enter, well, first of all, as we mentioned, if you don't have a plan, this is where you will know, but in the comments below, you're going to be writing that you're applying to create a plan or update a plan. But if you have yes for a project scoping or project, you're going to be entering those plan details. It's important to make sure that the plan name, the plan type, and the approval date are all up accurate as we have them on our records and as FEMA has them on their records. So this spreadsheet that is linked on this slide, as well as we will see it in the next slide as an example, will give the specific names, plan types, and approval dates that you will need to include. Next slide. So here you can see the county/cities and the plan names, plan types, approval dates, expiration dates. An important thing to notice is that majority of our plans in the state are local multi-jurisdictional, multi-hazard mitigation plans. These include regional and county plans because they're covering multi-jurisdictions. Multiple cities, towns, counties can adopt and be a part of these plans. An example of just local multi-hazard mitigation plan, you can see Castle Valley or Saratoga Springs. They have city-specific plans, so they're only covering one jurisdictions. Next slide. All right. So this is another important note, is that in the additional comments box, it is required to write how your project aligns with the local hazard mitigation plan. Here you're going to include exact page numbers, direct quotes from your plan, perhaps sections of the plan, and then you will also attach these sections along with it. The other important thing to know that this is just specific to the project type and mitigation plan. Project scoping, in the scope of work section, there's an actual section dedicated to showing how your plan or your project scoping aligns with your mitigation plan. So you won't have to worry about that here. Next. So to follow up with the requirement to tie the mitigation activity to the hazard mitigation plans, you can also find your specific plan at our website, hazards.utah.gov. From the far left, you can kind of see the regional mitigation plans. It will take you to this list of all the different plans. The example we have here is Salt Lake County's, and then their specific mitigation actions that you would want to put in their plan if they're applying for a grant specific to earthquakes is this section, and you'll include the page numbers and attachments of this section on that last mitigation plan application section. Next slide. Now here's a more specific example with very generic names of what you're going to put in that additional comments box. So as you can see, they put in the county pre-disaster mitigation plan, severe weather, including drought, earthquakes, are identified as the two most prevalent hazards that pose the most potential risk to the county. Some of the goals for X city found in this attachment, in this plan, specifically are to reduce the threat of earthquake damage to the city. Having those direct quotes and page numbers are what we'll be looking for and what FEMA will be looking for when they're reviewing these plans, just so they can really tie the projects to your plan and see that there is that full story kind of being painted and presented. And then at the end, oh, I forgot to mention this, please include the link to the plan as well. You see that last sentence, the county pre-disaster mitigation plan update can be found here, and then a link to the plan. This needs to be included in that additional comments section. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to be going over that scope of work section, as you can see on the far left. Here, you will see at the top right that this scope of work section, that each scope of work section is different depending on the plan, project type, or project. For projects, the different activity types that you'll see for the primary activity type is listed there. There's multiple different options. The FEMA Go manual that you will have access to kind of will give better definitions of these different activity types, so you can go through and see which one best fits for your project. It's important to just go as closely as possible, do the best as you can, and pick the activity type that works best. And then you can include a secondary or tertiary activity type. Those are optional. But then for plan, you'll see those different options: new plan, plan update, planning related activities, and then project scoping. Next slide. Okay, so here's where we're going to be going over the community lifelines. So the community lifelines are the most fundamental services in the community that, when stabilized, enable all other aspects of society to function. All these different definitions of community lifelines can be found in the FEMA Go manual. And it's also important just to pick the best community lifeline that fits with your project. You can see those different options for the primary community lifelines. And then this section also is where you'll fill out the hazard sources. Obviously, sometimes there's going to be multiple different hazards that are affected or impacted by your project scoping. Make sure to pick the hazard that just most relates to the project itself. For plans, if you know that flooding or earthquake or drought may have the most significant risk to your county, your city, your area, pick that one as the hazard that's going to be selected here. Next slide. All right. So now, as you can see on the top right, this is specific to the plan application type. So if you're applying for a plan, it has these 4 different sections right here: the evaluation process description, implementation process description, primary sources description, and staff and resources description. As a general note, make sure that each of your answers are complete sentences and longer than just a single sentence. You really want to give a lot of details, but in a way that is simple enough that anyone that's not from your area or not a engineer or someone in necessarily the direct technical field will be able to read and understand what is going on. So for the first one, this is where you're going to talk about the process you will be taking to review and update your plan, including gathering your team when reviewing the existing plan looks like, and just those typical steps that you're going to be doing in the evaluation process. For the implementation process, this is where you include the main steps and components that will go into the mitigation planning work. Be sure to reference FEMA's mitigation planning requirements and those other major parts of the full planning process. This does need to mention that in the end, it will result in a FEMA approved and adopted hazard mitigation plan. So you will then include that in that second box. The third box, primary source description. This is where you'll list the source of information that will be used during the mitigation planning process, such as previously completed mitigation plans and new or updated risk data sources. A good kind of idea of what can also be included in those are possibly general plans, primary master plans, growth and development plans, just different plans and data sources that will help inform what you'll be using in your mitigation planning process. Some other good resources would be UGS data, HAZUS, FEMA tools and data sources, and there's other federal data sources such as the National Weather Service. Then finally, the staff and resource description. It's important to list the staff and resources that will be helping with the development of the plan, discuss existing staff, and or if the work is going to be outsourced, if you're going to be getting a contract to do it, you will be contracting the work out, but also including which of your staff will be helping to oversee this. Next section. Here, we'll be going over the project scoping section of the scope of work section. So the 4 different questions here are: how will the mitigation activity be implemented? What is the scope of work of the proposal? Will it result in a completed project application for future funding opportunities? Third one is: who will manage and complete the mitigation activity? The 4th is: what are you doing to consider other risks in the project area? It's important when you're doing these that you really try to paint the whole picture of the process, as I mentioned earlier. For the first question, include if you'll be hiring a contractor and the different studies you're hoping to scope. Apologies if it gets a bit repetitive, but a lot of the times you'll notice you will find yourself writing, it seems like the same thing, but this is important to really be redundant and get a lot of what you're going for into the application. For the second question, give as much information as possible to really emphasize the need of the scoping project. Provide some context into the location, the why, the mitigation solution being scoped, along with who will be doing the project scoping. It might be a bit repetitive, as I mentioned, when you're talking about the contractor and who's doing the scoping, but it is important to include in both all these boxes some of this information. It's also important to explain whether project scoping will result in a completed project application for future funding opportunities. Explain how the mitigation solution being scoped will help inform or show the need for future mitigation action project to help mitigate the hazard, along with how the results from the project scoping will provide that necessary information for future applications. As Eric mentioned and Janessa, there's almost so much of that C and CB funding available before it would even have the option to go to projects funding from the state allocation. So having these scoping and being able to get that much information and explain how this will help provide a future project will make the next application cycle, or when you're ready for that, easier. And also there's points potential. For that third box, this is similar to the above question, but goes into the detail of who's managing the project, including the use of existing staff, the work contracted out, and how they're going to be working with the contractor. That third box, where you do consider the other risks in the project area. This is probably one of the more tricky questions that we see just in regarding project scoping. Here, they want you to describe the other risks associated with the project area. This means describing risks from like the same hazard being mitigated or other hazards that will need to be addressed during the project scoping. An example would be for a flood scoping project, perhaps looking at existing drainage or culverts and their capabilities. How would an earthquake potentially impact the infrastructure, or how would debris flows be considered in this project scoping? Be sure to include all potential other risks that could be related to the project being scoped that isn't the primary focus. Next section. So this is also for project scoping. That first box, is there an estimate for when the mitigation activity will take place? One thing to note in that red text is on the left, you'll see underneath the scope of work, there's the schedule section. In the next section, that will be covered. Just make sure that these two boxes and what you put, or this box right here and what you put in the schedule section, match. But here it will be a very general explanation of when the project scoping activity could begin and if it could be completed. One thing to know is that with FEMA, there are no certain dates. I'm sure people are familiar with this. So avoid putting specific dates in these sections, such as months and years, but instead include generals like fall or after it gets awarded. It doesn't have to be very specific. It just needs to make sure you match the schedule section. The next box, what alternatives will be considered? This could be a little confusing, especially for project scoping when you're looking into the options. So just try your best to explain why you are doing the scoping versus something else. Give an explanation for why the other options were not selected. Then the third box, do activities being considered align with the hazard mitigation plan? So as I previously mentioned in that mitigation plan section, for project scoping, this is where you're going to write that alignment. You're going to include the link to the plan. You're going to write specific pages, sections of the plan, quotes of the plan, and really tie those together. And then there's also a section on here, I don't think it's in this picture, but where you will add attachments. Just make sure that the attachments are well described and have proper descriptions to them so that it's easy to tie them together. Next box, or next slide. All right, now we're going into the project. This is the longest of the scope of work section, project application type. So for that first one, is it a phased project? So phased projects with FEMA are kind of described differently. Essentially, if your project is very complex or if there's not a lot of developed area in that space, it will likely be a phased project. It honestly just depends on how far along or like in the process project you are. So for that second box, are you doing construction in this project? Even if you're, so this one will be yes, no matter what, click yes on this question. Even if you're doing a generator project, you still be clicking yes on this one. For the third box, right, or that third arrow, the percentage of population impacted, you're going to be supplying the percentage of the population that will be affected by the proposed project. It is important in this portion because there are BRIC competitive points directly connected to this. As you can see from that bottom left little symbol, population impacted, that you get really creative and broad with how you describe the population impacted. So this would be by considering all components of the project and potentially impacted populations beyond those perhaps directly impacted. You can be really creative with these. If there is, and below you'll see that provided detailed description of population impacted. You can go into, if it's like a business area or if it's a very highly used road or something like that, take into consideration all of those that would be impacted by the shutting down of this road or different considerations like that. Another important thing is to include disadvantaged and socially underrepresented vulnerable populations. This can help with additional points as well for that BRIC competitive scoring. This would be a good portion and place to put it as well, to include how those directly disadvantaged impact or disadvantaged socially vulnerable populations are being impacted by the project as well. Next slide. Okay, this is going to get into the actual description of the project and the different components of it. As you can see from that first box, provide a clear and detailed description of your proposed activity. It is very important that this first sentence that you put in this box just clearly states what the project is. A lot of the times when we're reviewing them, the first box will kind of immediately go into the history to kind of paint the picture, which is good for the description itself. But when we're reading it, we want the very first sentence to just be straightforward. This is the project. This is why we're doing it. And this is the need. And then you can get really into the details, providing more of the context behind past events, some damage history, how the proposed project will mitigate these issues in the future. This is where you really need to kind of give the idea and create the story showing why this project is important and how it's going to help. A good consideration also to take into these is it can be really easy to get into technical talk and jargon. Try to make sure that you keep it detailed but simple enough that a non-engineer or professional will be able to comprehend what is being done, why it's being done, and the need for the project. That second box, how will the mitigation project or mitigation activity be implemented? Here you will explain the process that the subapplicant will follow to implement the mitigation project. You're going to want to include all the procurement steps, all the itty-bitty steps that you're going to go from construction, design, engineering, and show each of the steps for the implementation of the project. It's good to give a good overview, but not way into the weeds. If you have an extremely detailed process for implementation, you can always add it as an attachment or reference in the attachment section of this part of the FEMA Go application. That last box, describe how the project is technically feasible and will be effective in reducing the risk by reducing or eliminating damage to property and or loss in the project area. So here is where you will really attach and describe the attachments or include which attachments are attached, giving those specific design parameters, engineering documents, all the more technical and schematic documents that you'll be using to explain how the project will mitigate a hazard and the feasibility associated with that. Engineering design documents need to clearly show how the project will reduce the risk after it's completed. At the bottom, you can see kind of the engineering drawings, a clear explanation of the design parameters that we followed, and the level of protection, applicable building codes, et cetera, et cetera. These will often be provided by the design professionals, engineering professionals, or licensed architects. Next slide. Okay, who will manage and complete the mitigation activity? Here's where you explain how the project will be managed, explain whether existing or hired staff will be used, explain or state if contractors are going to be used in this section. Just clear, complete sentences on the management oversight of the mitigation activity. The next box, will the project address the hazards identified and what risk will remain from all hazards after project implementation or that residual risk? That little buzzword, as you can see, as Alex mentioned previously, make sure to use some of these words when you're describing these things to help with those points, potential points. This relates to that previous technical feasibility question also, but it's not as technical. It's more so looking at the what ifs or any other risks that will be possible after the project has been completed. So an example, if your project is designed or constructed to withstand a specific level or hazard rating, discuss the risk from an event greater than the proposed project was designed to withstand. Or you could also discuss other potential hazards that may pose a risk to the proposed project beyond that specific primary hazard that you're looking at. So perhaps if you're doing some kind of culvert or other project for flood risks, you could discuss if an earthquake occurred, would it be able to withstand an earthquake or other risks that occur with that? Okay, that third section, does the mitigation activity incorporate nature-based solutions? So this is another point potential area for that competition, the BRIC competitive scoring. As you can see there's either a 5 or 15 points potential. This is primarily used, well, the point potential is based on the scale of the project. The lower points, if it's more just neighborhood scale or site-specific scale. 15 points goes into if whether it is a watershed or landscape scale nature-based solution. So here you'll put yes, but you can see that there's not an actual box to describe how the mitigation activity will incorporate nature-based solutions. A good place to do this will be in the box above, which you're addressing the hazards identified, or even when the mitigation activity will take place. Just try to find ways that you can include nature-based solutions, another buzzword, if that is applicable to your project to help get those points. That last box, when will the mitigation activity take place? So similar to project scoping, this is also going to be a general narrative description about when the mitigation activity is going to be taking place. It will need to match what you put in the schedule section, but also take into account, as I mentioned previously, that there are no certain dates with FEMA. So it is okay and preferred not to be specific with the dates that you put. But it is important to note that you will want to kind of estimate your project taking the full 36 months as allotted by the grant performance period. So take that into consideration with when you're answering this question. Next question, or next slide. Okay, so we're almost done with the scope of work section. It's a large one. So the top box, explain why this project is the best alternative, what alternatives were considered to address the risk, and why was the proposed activity considered the best alternative? This is another tricky question that we see kind of get some confusion on. But essentially, you need to include at least 3 alternatives, including just writing do nothing and then explaining what would happen if you did nothing. Essentially, what you're trying to do is show why your activity or your proposed activity that you're applying for is the best one. You're going to write these different alternatives. So what are the potential problems, risk associated with those alternatives, and then explaining why it's not the best solution. These other alternatives that you come up with, they need to clearly show why they weren't selected and why the one you chose was the best option. There are many factors that can go into why you choose the proposed project over other alternatives, such as cost, mitigation capabilities, residual risk, environmental considerations, or any other potential cascading effects. Just make sure to clearly identify these and provide justification for your proposed activity. The second box, identify the entity that will perform the long-term maintenance and provide a maintenance schedule and cost information. So here you're going to name the entity that will be performing the long-term maintenance. You're going to be supplying a schedule of how often that maintenance will be conducted. If maintenance costs are applicable to the project, they must be included in the benefit cost analysis, which will be shown a little bit later on. However, they cannot be included in the project's detailed budget. Next slide, and I actually think that might be it for me.
All right, thanks, Mason. All right, I'm going to go over the remaining items in the FEMA Go sub-application. We're going to go over a schedule. So when you click on the schedule, there'll be a add a task button. And so you're going to have to click on that for every task in your schedule. And when you do your schedule, you have to make sure that no matter what you do, you have a minimum of 2 years. But the standard that everyone will get is 36 months. But just plan on like doing a minimum of 2 years. And if you have to overestimate, we find most projects take a lot longer than they anticipate. Almost every project we've seen. So you're just going to write a nice name for each task. And as you can see, for like example, for project scoping, you're going to want to include things for like procurement, the engineering analysis. If you're going to develop, let's say, mitigation strategies, if you're going to do a BCA and then close out, you want to do the major tasks for your project. Or, if you're going to do a plan, if you're going to hire a contractor, if you're going to, then you do like the different steps of a plan: risk assessment, the mitigation strategy portion, plan review, adoption, and closeout. For projects, you need to be more detailed. You don't want to go wildly crazy with just a lot of them, but you can't do just a few. And where you need to do more is in the like construction part. There are some simple ones like a generator or something that won't have a lot, or a very simple project, but you want to include just enough of what FEMA calls them is I'm forgetting the term off my head, not milestones, something like that. They're go, no go milestones. That's what it is. So like the major steps of your project, as well as procurement, engineering, if you have to do EHP, if you have to do things like that. There could be demobilization, certain steps like that at a big level. When you fill out after you do the task name for each one, per one, it'll have you do a task description. What will that task entail? That's where you get to go into a little more detail of what that will include. And then you're going to have to do a start month and a task duration in months. So just keep in mind, we find a lot that people will do calendar months, and it's not calendar months. Start month is the first month you're awarded, and that can vary. We don't know. So you put a 1 for the first task, and that will be the award month. And then how many months will that last? And you can have things that like overlap. You could have some things that start in month 1 and go all 36 months. And for each task, and then for like the second task, let's say you would do procurement and you think, okay, 1 month, it starts on the award month and it may last 2 months. Then your next task, be like, okay, whatever, we're going to hire a contractor or whatever, you would put the next, how long that would take if it's month 3, and then how long that will take. Just be aware that all of the tasks need to add up to your total, whether it's like 36 months, that it can add up to, I believe, I think last year they switched it to, you can have some projects up to, Alex, do you remember, is it an extra 12 months?
I am not sure off the top of my head.
Yes, I believe you're correct, Eric.
Okay, yeah, I think they just switched that last year, so we should have updated that. Sorry. I think you can have even more than 36 months. So for big projects, I think you can go up to 48. For the proposed project start and end date, so this will be after you do your different scheduled tasks and months and make sure it adds up to your total duration. You estimate that total duration. So if it's 36 months and you put 36 there, make sure all the tasks add up. And then as well, make sure it adds up to the project start and end date. And I know FEMA here is asking for month, day, and year. So don't worry. Even though you'll be putting in specific dates here, you won't be held to those because it will be unknown when it'll be awarded. So typically we just have you put, like, if you're a plan or project scoping, you could put something like September 1st or October 1st for this round would be like 2025. And then you would do the end date, make sure that's like, 24 or 36 months later, whatever you put. For projects, you might want to put later. You might want to put maybe like January 1st of 2026 or something. So, okay, next slide. All right, I put this in as an example. So if you are a project and you're a big project, FEMA is wanting more detail. And this is just a snapshot of one of our ones that was awarded. You can see there's a lot of steps in their schedule, and they didn't put every one of these in that schedule section, but they attached this, and FEMA is wanting details like this. So if you have a complex project, we highly recommend that you have an engineering firm or something that can have a more detailed schedule with the specific steps of the construction and stuff that you can attach. This will go a long way to help FEMA. These are the things they're asking for. They want to make sure that, hey, you have the schedule well planned out. You could do it in the time that you've said, and it's feasible, things like that. So be aware that FEMA is asking for more detail, and you need to have all your ducks in a row. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the next section is location. This only applies to project grants. The first box provide a detailed description of the project's location. So as you recall, back under community, there was in scope of work, there was a geographic areas description in the scope of work section. And that was more broad. So you don't want to just copy the information that was in the scope of work section and paste it here. This is more detailed, precise location information of your project. So you're going to narrow down more where the specific project is located in your community, the more specific one. And then you're going to include the latitude and longitude, and you'll use the number format up to 6 numbers after the decimal. That's what FEMA would like. And then you can attach a map as well of the community here, of the location, of the location. And then you can also attach it here, as well as we'll go later in the EHP section, a flood insurance rate map. So every project is required to submit a flood insurance rate map to show where your project location is in reference to the floodplain, the FEMA floodplain, to show if it's in that 100-year floodplain, because then it will trigger certain other review requirements and things like that. So this is where you can attach that as well. Next slide. Okay, so the next area of location is called the project benefiting area and the project impact area. And these are probably two of the most confusing questions in the entire sub-application that we see. And it can be very tricky for certain projects. So I'll just, the project benefiting area refers to the properties that might reasonably benefit from the proposed project. So if you have a flood drainage improvement project, and you're going to reduce the flood elevations downstream, the project benefit area would be those structures that would experience reduced flood depths because of the project. So you need to attach a map of that project benefiting area. The project impact area then is bigger now, even though it's kind of counterintuitive. It kind of seems like the impact area is the smaller area. The benefiting area is that directly benefiting area of your project. The impact area is the wider thing. So it goes beyond the project location. So you may have like a road that goes by where your project is, and you may have people that travel, and your road will protect a greater area. Or, it would include the example that we gave about the flood one. Those would include extent of upstream as well as downstream. So the larger area, the impact area. And you need to include a map of that. There are some rare type of projects where the project benefiting area and the project impact area have been known to be the same. So we can, as we review, we can discuss those. So be aware there are some exceptions to that, depending on the type of project. And those have usually been like water districts that are benefiting their entire water district by doing a system thing. And so it benefited it was the same. But typically projects will have different ones. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to the project site inventory, the last section here. So does this project sub-application propose to mitigate a property or structure? If so, you click yes. And then if you know the location of the structure, hopefully you do if you're doing a project. And then there's 2 methods to give FEMA information about your property / structures. On that select, you can select manual or import. And if manual, you'll open up a whole series of areas where, as you can see, some of them like, hey, add a building, and then you'll put like the year the building was built and all this information, the property owner, and then, or if it's add infrastructure utility, or if it's add vacant land, whatever it is, you'll click on it, open it up, and fill out the property information. There is an import function, but last year it didn't work. But it makes, you can download an Excel file with all the information. So let's say you were mitigating like 100 properties or something. It'd be easier to do an Excel file rather than one by one manually. The only problem is it wouldn't import. So the solution was, what we heard from FEMA is if you do it that way, just attach it. Just attach the Excel file. All right, next slide. All right, this was just an example. If you opened up the building, it would show, like you can see, open up for mitigation information, location, structure, insurance, cost effectiveness, owner. So it opens up a whole slew of things, and you'll need to know things like the foundation type, the building size, the year built, flood zone. So just be aware that you're going to need to know a lot of information about the buildings, homes, properties, whatever you're mitigating. You're going to need to know that stuff to fill out the sub-application. Okay, next slide. Okay. Oh, that was sorry. This was the example of if you click on the import, that's how you get to the Excel, and it'll take you to a FEMA website where you can download the Excel file. So next slide. So just really quick, in the location section, make sure you attach maps and photos of your location. So you can see this example, there's some, hey, some earthquake faults. As you can see that one where there's photos, it's really helpful if you label your photos of what we're looking at. So FEMA can look and say, okay, and different angles. This is from the east. This is from the south. Things like that are very helpful. Even having a Google above view, Google Earth view from above, and kind of showing the different areas is very helpful. Next slide. And here's an example of that special flood hazard area maps. As you can see, there's no specific requirement on what it needs to look like, but you can kind of see where you want to highlight where your project is and show that that floodplain. So FEMA can see if it's in the floodplain or not. And if it's in, then you'll have to do certain things and certain requirements if you get selected for your project. And if not, then FEMA will be able to see that. Okay, next slide. All right, now we're going to move over to the budget section really quick. The cost share is 75-25 normal, 75% federal, 25% local. There's a thing called Economically Disadvantaged Rural Community, an EDRC. It used to be called Small Impoverished Community. So this is up to a 90-10 split. And the 2 requirements are you have to be a community of 3,000 or fewer, and the average per capita annual income does not exceed 80% of the national one. So if you meet those 2 requirements, then you will need to provide documentation like census data that shows, hey, we're under 3,000, and then the annual per capita income, attach that, and you can get a 90-10 share on your sub-application. Okay, next. All right, once you click on the budget section, this applies to all 3. You will need to click that Add Cost Type button. It will open up 2 types of things. There's 2 types of cost. There's a cost estimate, which is sort of your normal budget for your project, and a management cost. And we will talk about how much you can do for management costs, but real quick, management costs are just basically your cost. If you want to claim costs to manage the not your project, but your grant, like quarterly reports. You can have money for that, and we'll go over the percentages and everything after this slide. So once you click on cost estimate, then it will open up this box where you need to add an item. This is where you will add all of your budget line items. And FEMA is wanting more and more details now, so you have to have enough of the major tasks on your budget. So we'll talk about, and you will click in like a description of it. The quantity, usually you put like 1 unit of measure like each, and then the price. And then the cost category, if it's like contractual or things, equipment, supplies, things like that. If you are claiming pre-award costs, so for whatever budget line item is part of a pre-award cost, you need to click that button. So if it was like you were wanting to do engineering pre-award, no construction items can be pre-award. It has to be anything before construction, and you are wanting to claim it. In other words, you could work on it before you get awarded. You click that pre-award. Just be aware, if you do and you don't get selected, you have to eat the cost. So, okay, next slide. Okay, so you can't just put construction as one of the line items. This is the one that has to at least be broken out into major construction tasks. So, so for a project, you're going to want to split it up, you know, to the a lot of your major tasks. So hopefully you may have received an estimate from an engineering firm or a contractor on your project. You will also need to attach that and include it as part of your budget narrative. But you'll need to break it out into different tasks. That's just a simplified one to show you. If you're doing a plan, your budget needs to be broken out by the main categories of the plan, like risk assessment, mitigation strategy, review adoption, if you want to hold meetings and have you know, like food and stuff for meetings. For project scoping, you're going to do your different steps of your project scoping. If you're going to do like an H&H study, perform analysis, write the report. If you're doing a BCA, things like that, break it out by the main tasks. Okay, next slide. Okay, so really quick. Pre-award costs, as we talked about, you can do like things like BCA, engineering, things like that. You must identify those, click that button if it's a pre-award or you can't claim the costs. And they can be part of your non-federal cost share. Management costs, as I mentioned earlier, this is the grant management cost, not project management, which can be its own item in the budget under the normal cost estimate type. You can ask up to 5% of your budget, and it's 100% federal share. So you can get 100% of it paid for, but just be aware it's only for quarterly reports, reimbursements, working with DEM. So just things like that, not overseeing your contractor, not things like that. Contingency costs. We see this one probably violated the most. You can only go up to 5%. So if you get an engineering cost estimate you're attaching and there's a contingency line item, we usually see something like 20%. FEMA will flag that and you will have to change it. So be aware that you can only do 5%. Now, it's really tough in today's environment with inflation. So what we suggest and what FEMA has also suggested is if you need more than 5%, build that into the other costs. So if you have construction line items, certain tasks, add some extra costs in those ones that you can anticipate for contingency, inflation, things like that. Overestimate in the other line items. And one thing to note that's starting new is if you add a contingency cost item, if one that's called contingency, we've heard from FEMA that they will hold back that line item until you need it, then you will have to request it. So if you want to avoid that, I would just build your contingency costs in all the other line items and just not say contingency, but you can have one up to 5%. Okay, again, the major task milestones. And for engineering, please keep in mind, you can only go up to 12% There are exceptions, but you will, if you have to go above for certain like major projects, something you have to provide justification of why. But the max is 12%. Next slide. And then you will get a cost share section under the budget, and make sure that percentage is what it's appropriate. If it's like 75-25, there are some times where a local community will take more of the share, but you don't get extra points for that, but that is allowed. Next slide. And then on the cost share section, you need to click that add funding source section. And this is where you will say where your local match is coming from, the name of it, the funding amount, the funding type, if it's cash, if it's from city funds, things like that. The estimated date of availability, you can just estimate, hey, it's available now or maybe next fall. Like you could put September 1st, 2025, or just whenever you have an estimated date of availability. And then a funds commitment letter date. So we'll talk about everyone must have a funds commitment letter that we'll talk about, that shows basically that you agree to pay the 25% or whatever your match is, and listed in there, whatever that date of that sign letter is, you're going to put there. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is just important. Every grant needs a budget narrative. So the budget you put in FEMA Go is more of like the simplified budget. And this example here is not, it's just a very simplified, like you can see, you can't just put construction, but just for illustrative purposes. But your budget narrative is where you go into detail. So if you have like engineering, then you need to show what is all going into the engineering. Or if you have one of your construction steps is like, hey, we're going to do this part of the road for culvert or put something in, or you need to then go into detail and show the different steps. And what's important is you need to show how you came up with your costs. So this is where likely an engineering bid, an estimate, things like that for each of the smaller items under that main task, how you came up with it. If there's personnel costs, okay, we're going to pay for 3 people at this rate, this many hours. That's how we came up with this estimate of this many thousands of dollars. Things like that. You need to show the justification of how you came up with your costs and your budget. That's very important. And don't just, if you do like an Excel or Word, it can be done, but FEMA likes it like official. Like, where did you come up with it? Was it this city engineer? Put like have it on official paper really helps, or if it's an engineering bid from the engineering firm. Otherwise, FEMA will likely flag it and be like, hey, where did it come from? Okay, next slide. This is what needs to be in your funds commitment letter. Address it to Kathy Holder, the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, a statement that your organization agrees to pay the 25%, the dollar amount, the estimated date of availability of the 25%, and sign it and date it. So just be aware that this needs to be attached. If things are in flux, do this later so you don't have to get it signed more than once. Okay, next slide. As part of another attachment in the budget section, everyone is required to fill out an SF424 form that will be provided in your Google Drive folder. Here's some information that helps on some common questions, and that will be supplied, like what the funding opportunity number is, the title, and the executive order. Click C on that one. For FMA, it's right there as well. And there will be some, I think, federal instructions as well as what they're looking for. And you only need to fill out the yellow highlighted boxes. Next slide. So for those doing plans or project scoping, you're required to do an SF424A and an SF424B. The A is just budget information. We will provide these in the Google Drive folder, as well as some instructions on what they're looking for. And the B one is just to sign it. It will just be signed and dated once you read through. Okay, next. For projects, you're required to do C and D, and there's just different for those doing construction, and those will be provided to you as well. Next slide. Okay, for BCA, This only applies to project grants. You are required to do a benefit cost analysis. We will go into more detail in a little bit later, but here's just where you will put the summary of everything. If the BCA was completed in FEMA's BCA toolkit, you will click that button. And then you will provide what are the total project benefits. So that will be determined in that toolkit. What is the total project cost and what is the benefit cost ratio? So in order to apply for a project grant, your benefit cost ratio must be 1.0 or greater. And you do not receive more points if, let's say, it was a 7 or a 14 or 1.1. 1.0 and a 21 get the same points in FEMA. So just be aware of that. And then there's some other buttons you'll click if you, like, say, were environmental benefits added to the project and were social benefits. Most typically, a lot of people will use contractors to help with the BCA, especially if it's a bigger project. And like you said, you can get reimbursed for that if you put that in your budget as a pre-award cost item and you were selected, then you could, or you could use it as part of your local cost, but you do risk the chance of eating the cost if you don't get selected. Okay, next slide. You also have to attach BCA documentation. We've heard from the federal level, this is one of the reasons why most projects get determined ineligible, because their BCA didn't have any documentation. Like, you can do your BCA report, but in your BCA report, where you came up with the numbers and how you came up with, like, past damage and project useful life, things like that, you need to show how you came up with it. So we'll go a little bit more into detail of what those three things that need to be attached, and as well as those under $1 million won't need to do these. They'll do a narrative attachment of the narrative. Okay, next slide. Okay, there will be an EHP section. There's sections A through K, and this is only for projects. And it goes through different federal sort of like acts, the National Historic Preservation Act, the National Historic, like for if it's buildings or if it's archaeology, or there's the floodplain or the Clean Air Act, things like that. And you need to determine if your project will impact those or not. And so, example, the first one, if your project is affecting a building or structure that is 50 years or more, it's an automatic yes for this National Historic Preservation Act. We will provide this Utah EHP green sheet in your Google Drive folder. And what's the thing to, as you fill this out, A through K, once you click yes, it'll open up a bunch of other questions like, hey, you need to attach a map of this area, or describe wetlands. Will it affect wetlands? You need to describe, or there's brush. You're going to need to tell what type of vegetation there is that you might affect with ground disturbance. The past history of ground disturbance, show a map of what was, where the ground disturbance was before, or there'll be one about the floodplain where you can attach that floodplain map as well. You will need to reach out to certain environmental agencies in Utah, like if it's over 50 years old, you will need to reach out to the State Historic Preservation Office, SHPO. There will be contact information. You can just give a brief detail of what your project is, and then you could attach, you don't need a response yet, but you can attach your correspondence and say, hey, we reached out to SHPO and informed them of our project, the location, and there's a structure. So there are a few things like that. And you'll just go through. Typically, this isn't too bad for projects unless you're a major, a really big project. Most of them will be no, but like things like the 50 years, the ground disturbance, and the wetland the floodplain ones are typically yes on those. Okay, next slide. So that was just an example of what happens when you click yes. You can see it asks for things like the property address and an original date of construction for each property, a minimum of 2 color photographs, a diagram or UGS map showing the property. And then, so just be aware that you'll need to fill out each thing based on if you click yes or no. Next slide. So if your project, as I mentioned earlier, if your project impacts any of those EHP items, you may be required to consult with those. And just be aware that FEMA does the main consulting with, if your project gets selected, FEMA itself will do the main consulting with a lot of these agencies to make sure they comply with the federal requirements. So they take that burden upon themselves, but you need to at least initiate, let's say, with the SHPO. Okay, next slide. Evaluation section. So these are just typically like yes or no questions on some of them. The first one is the applicant participating in the community rating system. As you can see right there, those are all of the communities in Utah that participate, as well as their score. So you can look if you're one of those. If not, click no. Is the applicant a cooperating technical partner? So click no. There's only one CTP in Utah, and that is the Division of Emergency Management. So everyone will click no on that. And then if you were generated from a previous either hazard advanced assistance or project scoping, you would click yes there, and then you would attach maybe your documentation that your application is, you had a previous sub application or any other federal grant award that related to this project. So if you're doing a project and you had some other federal grant that helped you get to this point, you can get extra points for this, and you'd click yes there. For the building code question on the next one, everyone needs to click yes because Utah adopts it on statewide, and put 2021 and then IBC and IRC. So make sure you fill those out. Those get us points in Utah. So it's really good. Next slide. And then the next question is the building code effectiveness grading schedule. So this is big. You can get up to 20 BRIC points. If your community participates in this BSEGS, click yes and then select the rating. Just a thing to note, there are residential and commercial, and FEMA says you can pick the lower of the two. So if you have 1 through 5 and one of the ones is 1 or 5, click the one that's or after, because it goes up to 10. If one of them's like a 6 or 7, one's a 2 or 3, click the one that's between 1 and 5 so you can get the points. Special districts can't qualify for BSEGs, but we've been told from FEMA they can use the community's BSEGs that their project is in. And if so, in the comment section, say that, and then provide documentation that, hey, we're using, Salt Lake City's BSEGs, which is a rating of this or something. So be aware if you're a special district. Okay, next slide. Describe involvement of partners to enhance the mitigation activity. So they're really looking, for grants if you're partnering with someone. There can be high-level partners, but it's really geared towards like full-on partners, especially if they're going to also chip in some of the cost share. But that doesn't typically happen. But I would try to get partners here. What I've also learned is it may be helpful to get help from your government. Like I would talk to your Congress man or woman to maybe provide support. That can go a long way with FEMA if you got letters from representatives, things like that. That can really help. And then the next question is, this is a big one for points. Discuss how anticipated future conditions are addressed by this project. So it can be anything from, do you expect population changes, land use changes, development shifts, aging population shifts, income, there's a whole bunch of things. This is where also your changing climate comes in. This is where you can provide that data, the description, and then I would provide an attachment as well that shows how your project anticipates addressing those. So like, hey, Utah is one of the fastest growing states, or if you're like in Utah County, and our project can help alleviate, help protect future population changes as it continues to grow, things like that. Okay, next slide. And then for plan, this is only for plan. Describe how this planning activity benefits your community and how the plan data will be used to promote resiliency. So you'll just provide a description there of how your mitigation plan will go to benefit your community. Next slide. And finally, you'll do assurances and certifications. This is where lobbying, if you are going to do lobbying that directly benefits your project, then you need to disclose that. If not, you'll just click that, which is what most people do, that box, and then you're good with that. Next slide. And then review. You can see as long as all of those check marks are green, you will be able to submit your application. Just be aware, do not push the submit button. So this is FEMA Go. So you'll initially do your sub-application in that Google Drive folder, that Google Doc. Unless FEMA opens it up, then you'll do it in, you'll need, whenever they open it up, you'll transfer it into FEMA Go. But don't push the submit button until DM tells you, go ahead and submit, because you won't be able to make changes if you push the submit, and the state will review your sub-application first, provide feedback. You will then go in and make changes, and then once it's done and polished and everything done, then you will click submit. Next slide. Okay, this is just a summary of all of the attachments, or at least all of them, not necessarily all, for each project type. One thing I will just mention really quick with mitigation plans, you need to provide participation letters. So what that is any jurisdiction that wants to participate in your mitigation plan update, whether it be a city, a town, a school district, a water district, a university, they need to provide a participation letter, and you can give them the template. They need to sign it, send it to you, and then you will add that. You can add that in the community section if you want. There's an exception. AOGs, since they have jurisdiction over like cities and towns, they can do one participation letter that then lists each of the ones they want to do. If you need examples, I can provide examples of that for those doing plans. One other note, if you're going to claim indirect costs, you need to provide an indirect cost rate agreement in your budget section. So you must include that agreement that you have if you're going to claim that. And if you are doing an acquisition project, in other words, you're going to acquire a property with buildings, like with an actual building on it, contact me, because I will send you a slew of things that you will have to do. So if you're doing acquisition, please contact me. Next slide. New this year, just everyone will be required to fill out this state review checklist. It has, I don't know, 100 and something. It basically just goes over every question in the sub-application, whether you did yes or no. And if you click no, then you need to provide justification of why you click no. And you can see there's several category or lines, columns 1, 2, 3. You will fill out one. Then the state, we will go through it. At least 2 state people will review every question, and we will likely also have a contractor review it as well. So this will help basically inform the RFI. If there's a no and it wasn't satisfied, we will send an RFI of why it should be, if it needs to be fixed. For project grants, you will also be required to fill out a BRIC scoring spreadsheet. This is what we use as well to score and rank your guys' applications, and they're basically just the FEMA BRIC points. And we'll just have you determine what you think, what you can score. This is basically what the reviewers at the national level will do as well. They'll score your criteria. We'll go over those in a minute, and you'll just be required to fill those out as well. Next slide. I'll turn the time over to Miranda.
Thanks, Eric. So I'll be going through the benefit cost analysis. I'll call this the BCA. This is only for project grants. A lot of this information Eric kind of already went over, but I'll just go into more detail on what's needed. Next slide. So the BCA toolkit is an extension for Excel. You'll download that. We have a link right there. And we'll also have some documents for you guys to use for assistance. These documents will be in the drive, which are your supporting documents that Eric will send you. So all this will be in there for your reference. Next slide. So again, this is only for project grants, so you won't be doing this for plans or project scoping. This will create a benefit cost ratio. It must be above a 1. And kind of like Eric mentioned, the BCA costs are eligible for pre-award cost if you get awarded. So to do this, you must have a pre-award cost line in your budget. So this isn't going to be within like your management costs or anything. This has to have its own approved line item in your budget. The budget narrative must identify your BCA costs. And if you have a contractor do this for you, please have them invoice you separately for the BCA costs. While you're doing your BCA, if you have any questions, please reach out to the BCA helpline. We have information on that below on the slide. After you reach out to them, if you still have questions, DEM has hired a BCA specialist to help with any other questions outside of what the helpline can help you with. So just reach out to us and we can get you in contact with them. Next slide. So documenting your BCA is essential. So please document. This will all just be some supporting documentation that you'll add to when you submit your BCA. The FEMA National Technical Review will evaluate the accuracy and completeness of the BCA. All data entry should be backed up with records or citations like websites. Backups can include letters, FEMA project worksheets, photographs, maps, census data, estimates from experts, etc. So next slide. This is what you'll be submitting. It'll be your BCA Excel file. So that'll be submitted in the Excel format. You'll also submit the BCA report. This will be in a PDF format. And then also a zip file just containing all of that documentation I talked about. So any supporting documentation for your BCA, you'll also submit in that zip file. Next slide. So Eric mentioned this, there is a new BCA narrative. I'll kind of go into details of what this is. So from FEMA, this is sub-applicants may submit a cost effectiveness narrative rather than a BCA for projects costing less than 1 million. A cost effectiveness narrative is a written description, including both quantitative and qualitative data on how a proposed mitigation project will benefit the community by protecting lives in the built environment. Sub-applicants should ensure that they address the following questions in their narrative. So I'll go through all these questions and then I'll kind of give examples on what you can, and kind of what the answers would be for these kind of questions. So number 1, how often does the hazard being mitigated occur? Number 2, how many people benefit from the proposed mitigation project and how was this number determined? Number 3, what structures, infrastructure, and or building contents, if any, will be damaged if the project was not implemented? Number 4, what public services, including public safety, transportation, utilities, and or businesses, if any, would lose function during future hazard events if this project was not implemented? And number 5, are there any additional benefits directly attributable to the proposed project that are not captured elsewhere in the cost effectiveness narrative? So some examples you can use. I live in Clearfield, so I'll use that as my example. For number 1, you can say like power outages occur at the Clearfield Fire Station once every 3 to 5 years. For number 2, an example can be the proposed mitigation project installing a generator at the Clearfield Fire Station benefits the fire station service population of 700 residents. For number 3, it could be something like if the proposed mitigation project is not implemented, Clearfield Middle School will continue to experience flooding in the auditorium and classrooms of the north side of the building, damaging school equipment and resulting in costly mold remediation. For number 4, it could be something like if the culvert under Main Street at Muddy Creek is not upsized, Main Street will continue to flood during intense rainfall events and impede access to the shopping center. And number 5 could be, would the project result in avoided injuries or deaths, reducing emergency management costs, reduce maintenance costs, protection of cultural, historic, or agricultural resources, reduce carbon emissions, or other economic benefits to the community. Next slide, Alex. There's a document that has all these examples and questions on it. That's also going to be attached in the drive for your reference if you are looking to do this new BCA narrative. When submitting this in FEMA Go, I'll briefly go through this, but The cost-effective narrative should be in a Microsoft Word or Adobe PDF format and attached to the cost-effectiveness section of the FEMA Go sub-application. For the question, how is cost-effectiveness determined for this project? The sub-applicant should select other BCA methodology approved by FEMA in writing. The question, for the total project benefits, enter a value equal to the project costs. For the question, was sea level rise incorporated into the flood elevations in the BCA? You'll select no. For the question, were environmental benefits added to the project benefits? You'll select no. And for the question, were social benefits added to the project benefits? You'll also select no. So again, all of this is on that document and it'll be in the drive for your reference. Next slide. So I'll kind of talk about the review process with the state. So submission, the submission deadline is September 30th. And like Eric mentioned, this will be done through Google. Complete sub-applications will be submitted in the drive first unless Eric suggests otherwise. Again, do not hit the submit button in FEMA Go until you're instructed to do so and you have a complete and kind of polished application. But projects will be submitted in FEMA Go as the final submission. When DEM reviews your project, if we have any questions, we'll submit an RFI and give you a deadline for that. We'll let you know again of any final submission deadlines. And yeah, the final application will be in FEMA Go. Next slide. So again, I'll keep going through this kind of review process and what it looks like on our end. Next slide, Alex. So for the state review, we'll review your project and rank it. We look for the eligibility and completeness of your project. Again, if there's any questions that arise during this process, we'll send you a request for information. This is an RFI. The BCA will be reviewed by our BCA specialists that we have hired. The state will review and score your project. And then the state ranks all the sub-applications based on their scores. Next slide. So this is kind of a outline of kind of the process of things. So the very first one you see is the state review and ranking. So that is done by us at DEM. After that, this is all FEMA. So after our review, we will submit the applications. FEMA will then complete a eligibility and completeness review. After that, it'll move on to a technical evaluation. After that, it'll move on to a qualitative evaluation. And then that's when FEMA will notify the notice of selection. So the first one is the state, and then everything else will be through FEMA. Next slide. So again, on FEMA's end, when they receive the projects, they will do their eligibility and completeness review. This will review the eligibility of the subapplicant and the proposed activity and cost. Also review the completeness of the subapplicant. They'll look at cost effectiveness and engineering feasibility. Also reviewing the alignment with the state mitigation plan and the local hazard mitigation plan. So this will occur, be the first step after submitting your application. So usually this is a month or two after submission. So usually this will be probably during early 2025. Next slide. So I'll get into some of the detail of the technical evaluation. We will get into, more specifics on the next slide. This is FEMA's technical evaluation. Kind of what I'll be going through. This is last year's criteria. So we don't expect it to change very much, but they may tweak some things like numbers and points and such like that. Sub-applicants submitted to the national competition that passed the eligibility and completeness review will be scored with technical evaluation criteria. So this can be a screening tool for the next section, which will be qualitative evaluation review. Next slide, Alex. So I'll kind of go through each one and give just a little more detail on kind of how, what they're looking for in the points. So again, these points may be slightly changed this year because this is last year's criteria, but we expect it to be very similar if it does change. So the scoring is binary. You either get it or you don't. And this is a section where you can really become competitive. So for the first one, infrastructure project, to receive the point allotment for this criteria, the sub-application must explain how the project mitigates natural hazard risks to critical physical structures, facilities, and systems that provide support to a community, its population, and its economy. And this includes natural systems. For the next one, the nature-based solutions. To receive the points for this criteria, the sub-application must describe how the project incorporates one or more nature-based solutions. Applicants or sub-applicants should include a description and documentation how the project incorporates nature-based solutions in the scope of work section and location section in FEMA Go. Documentation should include stamped and sealed reports, design documents, technical drawings, surveys, studies, project site maps, historical data, etc. For the third one, with building codes, this criteria is evaluating the status of building code adoption and building code enforcement. Eric did kind of briefly go over this. So for building code adoption, Utah adopted building code, so you should get those points. For building code enforcement, this will be evaluated using the building code effectiveness grading schedule, the BCEGS, which is an independent assessment of a community's building code adoption and enforcement activities, resulting in a score of 1, which would be the best, to 5. This evaluation applies to sub-applicants only. For number 4, talking about technical assistance or previous award. So to receive the points for this one, a sub-applicant must demonstrate and document that the sub-application was generated either from a previous FEMA HMA scoping project. If this is applicable, sub-applicant should include information on their previous award in the evaluation section of FEMA Go. Or this can be the sub-application is a past recipient of BRIC Direct Technical Assistance. This is not to be confused with Utah's Direct Technical Assistance. This would be FEMA's Direct Technical Assistance. So the one that Utah provides is separate, and Kathy will go into that in a little bit as well. And then for the last one, Eric kind of touched on this in the beginning with those different maps and the different areas in Utah where you can receive more points. So kind of breaking that down. For this section, applicants must document their designation as an economically disadvantaged rural community, EDRC, that would be 40 points. Or you can also receive the full 40 points if the application's benefit or primary benefit a community disaster resilience zone, that's a CDRZ. Or an application benefiting or primarily benefiting a Justice 40 community or communities must be identified by the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, the CJES. That would be 30 points. So this was a major focus for FEMA in 2023, really utilizing those tools. And this is the biggest part of the technical evaluation with the most points. So next slide. And I think that's all for me. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Miranda. So I'm going to go over the qualitative criteria. And for the National Review Panel, they score sub-applications based on the qualitative criteria. Qualitative criteria are narrative submissions to allow you the flexibility to explain the strengths of your project. Scoring is on a grading scale, and there are 100 points possible. These are for project grants only. So just to go over them, there is risk reduction / resilience effectiveness, climate change and other future conditions, implementation measures, population impacted, community engagement and other outreach activities, and leveraging partners. This year, we are requiring that you attach a BRIC scoring document. This must include the qualitative criteria, but you can also do the technical criteria. Please answer each question from the BRIC grant prompts document, which will be given to each sub-applicant. You do not need to use our template. You can make your own, but please make sure that you include where the qualitative criteria are found in your sub-application. This document is an opportunity for you to highlight each section of the sub-application that demonstrates the qualitative criteria. Follow the prompts and criteria with the correct wording is key to getting the most points possible. This is going to be just an example of using the prompts to meet scoring criteria. So this is for criteria 2 and its future conditions. The overview is, does the grant describe how the project will anticipate future conditions such as sea level rise and/or population, demographic, and climate change? If so, does the sub-application cite data sources, assumptions, and models used for predictions? Applicants and sub-applicants should include climate change and other future condition information in the evaluation section of FEMA Go. And then we just have some examples listed here for future conditions criteria. And since we are getting kind of closer to time, I won't go through these, but I just want to go over some tips that I was able to learn. I was able to participate in the BRIC National Qualitative Criteria Review Panel last year for the last grant cycle. And some of these tips help the reviewers to easily understand what it is you are trying to accomplish with the project. Some sub-applications will have lots of attachments. It's extremely important to appropriately name each attachment and add a description of what the attachment contains. In the sub-application, please refer to any attachments as you have named them. If an attachment cannot be opened, once it is in review, there is not an opportunity to have you send or attach it in an alternative format. So please just double check those attachments before you submit your sub-application. Please break up large attachments into multiple attachments and clearly label them as such. Having the BRIC qualitative criteria document attached allows a reviewer to easily navigate through the sub-application to clearly identify where the qualitative criteria information is met. When writing your sub-application, write clearly and simply with FEMA and the panel reviewers in mind. Avoid lots of technical jargon. Remember that those reviewing your grant may know nothing about Utah or the exact project you're doing. And then I just wanted to go over a few notes that I made during the review panel. And just some tips that I've noticed is when you are referring to an attachment, please have that written very clearly. Sometimes there are over 30 attachments in one sub-application, and as a reviewer, I'm not going to go look through every single one to go find that information if it's not clearly listed. And because sometimes people won't list their information for the qualitative criteria very clearly, you will miss out on points because I'm not going to go dig through your sub-application if it's not clearly addressed. One example is we had one where they attached like a 300-page document, and in the very middle of it, there was a little sentence about a disadvantaged community. Because one reviewer decided to do a little more digging, they found that one sentence, but it did result in a lack of points from every other reviewer except the one, because we were instructed not to go digging for information. So by having this document attached, the reviewers can easily go and say, okay, so they have a risk reduction information in the scope of work, the evaluation, in their mitigation plan, all of these different sections, and it's clearly identifiable, so you could get the full potential 30 points. So if you have any questions on the qualitative sections, please reach out to me and we can go over any more tips or instructions going forward. But next I'll turn it over to Kathy for the direct technical assistance.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. Because we are at time right now, and if you need to leave, feel free to go ahead and drop. I'm going to put in the chat a fact sheet for the direct technical assistance that I'm going to be talking about. So if you take that with you if you need to leave. But we're going to go ahead and take the time to talk about this if you do have time to stick around. And otherwise, we will be sending out this video later along with documentation. So feel free to leave if you need to, but stick around if you'd like. All right, next slide. So with our Utah Direct Technical Assistance, we currently have a contractor that is contracted with Utah at the DEM to do this work that I'm going to talk about for you at the community level if you apply and are qualified to get our Utah Direct Technical Assistance. So this is not funding that goes to you. It is our contractor doing the work for you to lead you up to being able to do mitigation actions and apply for a mitigation grant possibly. Next slide. So examples of what DTA can do for you, they could help you with your hazard mitigation plan development. They could help you identify and conceptualize and scope out your project that you might be interested in. They can help you with a benefits cost analysis. They can even write your BRIC or HMGP grant for you. So these, and if you could look at the list, there's a lot of things that they can do up to the point of they cannot do a mitigation project, but they can do all those pieces beforehand. Next slide. So how do you apply for DTA? We have, and I've put it in the link in the chat as well. We have a fact sheet that goes over a little bit more about this. And in that fact sheet, there is an NOI link that you can go in and fill it out. It's a very simple process. I would think for most people, but not everybody, of course, about 10 to 20 minutes to fill out the application for direct technical assistance. This program is for communities that have capability and capacity concerns. And so, you know, if you already have a full engineering staff and all the bells and whistles, you may not qualify for this. But a good example, if you're like a rural community and you have very little staff and not a lot of resources, this can really help you quite a bit to get to where you can put in your grant. The reason we wanted to talk about DTA right now is because, as you've noticed, putting in for a BRIC or an FMA grant can have a lot of different pieces to it. And there's a lot of information that you need to bring to the table to have a competitive project. And so we wanted to give those communities who have that capability and capacity concern an option to have a contractor help them if they can't fund that kind of a thing for themselves. And so we really encourage you to apply for DTA if you meet that criteria within the fact sheet and NOI. It gives you what that criteria is. One of them is being a rural community here in Utah. So go check it out and see if that's something that could help you to apply for. And this could be for BRIC, could be for HMGP, could be for if you're going to try for both, and going from there. Next slide. So we do have a link, and when we share out these slides and the information, we'll make sure you have it, to a story map that shows communities who are getting direct technical assistance. So that might help you like envision what your direct technical assistance could look like. And on this right now, we have 20 plus applicants who have applied and are receiving Utah direct technical assistance right now. But until we run out of funds to do this, we're going to keep going through and helping our Utah communities. Next slide. When you go there, you can see where the DTA projects are and get a little bit of story about what information or what is happening for those individuals. Next slide. All right, what's next? Eric, I'll let you take this.
Okay, yeah, we're at the end. Basically now your NOI is due by August 30th if you want to apply. And then the submissions will go, the submissions of sub-applications in FEMA go by September 30th. And we'll rank them and submit them to FEMA. And they'll go through that review process that we went through. And then the anticipated award date is 2025 or beyond. So just be aware that it's a long process. And if you have any questions, you feel free to email us or call us, and we will be happy to help you out with anything that we can. And we will stop the recording right now. Thank you for attending. We will stay on.